The big boy produced 6,290 horsepower. The EMD F7 diesel produced 1,500 horsepower. On paper, Big Boy was 4 times more powerful. In reality, the diesel destroyed it. Not because it was stronger, because strength didn't matter. By 1950, a single EMD F7 diesel unit, weighing 230,000 pounds and producing 1,500 horsepower, could operate anywhere on Union Pacific's system without restriction. A big boy, weighing 1.2 million pounds and producing 6,290 horsepower, could only operate on heavily reinforced routes that had cost millions to upgrade. The diesel was half the weight, a quarter the power, and infinitely more useful. And when you coupled 3 F7s together under the control of a single engineer, you had 4,500 horsepower that could run 500 miles without stopping, required maintenance every 6 months instead of every 6 weeks. Gallon cost 40% less per ton-mile to operate than the most powerful steam locomotive ever built. The math was brutal, and Union Pacific's executives knew it. This is the story of how a machine with less power won by being better at everything that actually mattered, and why the big boy, engineering marvel, American legend, icon of steam power, couldn't survive against a competitor that simply worked. The problem with Big Boy wasn't that it failed. It performed exactly as designed. It pulled 4,000 tons over Sherman Hill. It eliminated helper engines. It consolidated power. Everything the railroad asked for, it delivered. But the cost of delivering that performance was unsustainable. And diesel-electric technology exposed that reality in ways Union Pacific couldn't ignore. When Electromotive Division delivered the first freight diesels in the mid-1940s, Union Pacific's mechanical department dismissed them as suitable only for passenger service and light freight. The conventional wisdom was clear. Heavy freight over mountain grades required steam power. Diesels were unproven, experimental, interesting but not serious competition for machines like Big Boy. That assessment lasted about 18 months. Then the data started coming in. EMD's FT freight diesels, introduced in 1939 and mass-produced during and after World War II, were demonstrating something Union Pacific's steam advocates hadn't anticipated: operational flexibility that fundamentally changed railroad economics. An FT diesel unit weighed 230,000 pounds, less than 1/5 of a big boy. Its axle loading was 57,500 pounds per axle, comfortably within standard track limits. It required no special infrastructure, no reinforced bridges, no upgraded turntables, no expanded roundhouses. It could operate on any route in the system that could handle conventional steam locomotives, which meant it could operate everywhere. The big boy, by contrast, was infrastructure dependent. It could only run where the railroad had spent millions preparing the route to handle 600 tons of locomotive. Thus, that limited its operational territory to a handful of main lines. Everywhere else, lighter power was required. The most powerful locomotive in North America spent much of its potential economic life sitting idle because the infrastructure couldn't support it where it was needed. Diesels had another advantage steam couldn't match: multiple unit operation. You could couple 2, 3, 4 diesel units together, and a single engineer in the lead unit controlled all of them through a system of electrical cables connecting throttle and brake commands. One crew, multiple locomotives, combined horsepower that could be scaled to match the load without the complexity of coordinating multiple engineers. Consist of 3 EMD F7 diesel units, the model introduced in 1949, produced 4,500 combined horsepower with a total weight of 690,000 pounds. Less than 2/3 of a big boy's weight, about 70% of its horsepower, but operationally superior in almost every measurable way. The fuel comparison was devastating. Thus, a big boy burned 16 to 18 tons of coal per run from Cheyenne to Ogden, roughly 125 miles. It consumed 25,000 gallons of water, requiring refills every 100 miles. Coal had to be loaded by hand or mechanical stoker. Water towers had to be maintained and heated in winter to prevent freezing. The entire fuel infrastructure for steam was labor-intensive and geographically fixed. Diesel units burned fuel oil. A 3-unit F7 could run 500 miles between refueling stops. No water required. Yet refueling took minutes instead of the half-hour required to coal and water a big boy. And diesel fuel could be stored in simple tanks anywhere along the line. No specialized infrastructure, no winter heating, no coal handling equipment. The maintenance difference was even more dramatic. Big Boy required a full mechanical inspection every 10,000 to 12,000 miles. Boiler washouts every 30 days. Flue replacements every few months because high-pressure steam eroded the tubes faster than lower-pressure designs. And the articulated frame needed constant adjustment to prevent binding. Driving boxes required regular packing and lubrication. Side rods had to be inspected for cracks and wear. The firebox had to be cleaned of ash and clinker daily. Every one of these maintenance tasks required specialized tools, trained mechanics, and downtime. A Big Boy spent roughly 30 to 35% of its operational life in the shop. For every 3 days pulling freight, it spent more than a day being maintained. Diesel maintenance was simpler. No boiler, no fire, and no steam pressure to manage. The diesel engine drove a generator. The generator powered electric traction motors on the axles. Fewer moving parts. No reciprocating mass pounding the machinery thousands of times per mile. Maintenance intervals measured in months instead of weeks. When a diesel went into the shop, it was usually for routine inspection and minor adjustments, not major mechanical overhauls. And when something did break on a diesel the other units kept working. If one F7 in a 3-unit had mechanical trouble, yet the engineer could isolate it and continue with the remaining 2 units at reduced power. The train kept moving. Revenue service continued. When a Big Boy broke down, the entire 6,290 horsepower went offline. The train stalled. Helper engines or a replacement locomotive had to be dispatched. Revenue service stopped. Union Pacific's accounting department tracked all of this obsessively. By 1948, the cost per ton-mile data was unambiguous. Diesel operation was 35 to 40% cheaper than steam on a fully loaded basis. Its labor costs were lower. Diesels required smaller crews and less frequent servicing. Fuel costs were lower despite diesel fuel being more expensive per gallon than coal per ton because thermal efficiency was dramatically better. Infrastructure costs were lower because diesels didn't require specialized facilities. The only category where steam had an advantage was capital cost. A Big Boy cost approximately $265,000 in 1941. An EMD F7 diesel unit cost about $175,000 in 1949. But you needed 3 F7s to match Big Boy's power. So the capital cost was roughly $525,000 for equivalent horsepower, except that comparison missed the point entirely. You didn't need equivalent horsepower. You needed equivalent operational capability. And 3 F7s delivered far more operational capability than one Big Boy despite having less raw horsepower because they could operate anywhere, anytime, with less maintenance and better fuel economy. The operational flexibility alone justified the higher capital cost. But Union Pacific's executives were discovering something else. Diesel reliability was reducing the total number of locomotives needed system-wide. Steam locomotives spent so much time in maintenance that the railroad had to own significantly more units than daily operations required just to keep enough in service. Diesels, with their higher availability rates, meant fewer total units were needed to maintain the same level of service. When you factored in reduced infrastructure costs, lower maintenance, better fuel economy, smaller crews and fewer total locomotives needed, the economic case for diesel became overwhelming. Not marginal, not debatable, overwhelming. Union Pacific began ordering diesels in volume in 1947. EMD F3s and F7s for freight. E-Series passenger diesels. Alco PA and FA units. The orders kept coming. Dozens of units, then hundreds. And every diesel delivered was one more steam locomotive that became redundant. including Big Boy. The irony was brutal. Union Pacific had spent millions preparing its infrastructure to handle Big Boy operations: heavy rail, reinforced bridges, enlarged turntables, expanded shop facilities. All of that investment had been justified by the expectation that Big Boys would operate for 30 to 40 years, amortizing the infrastructure cost over decades of service. Instead, Big Boys operated for less than 20 years. Some units logged barely 15 years of service before being retired. As the infrastructure investments didn't pay off because the technology they supported became obsolete faster than anyone anticipated. By 1952, Big Boys were being assigned to fewer and fewer runs. Diesels were taking over mainline freight. The Big Boys that remained in service operated on routes where their power was genuinely needed. Heavy tonnage over Sherman Hill, mostly. But even there, diesel consists were proving they could do the job with better overall economics. The final blow came from operational flexibility. Sherman Hill was a bottleneck. Add trains assembled in Cheyenne, hauled over the grade to Ogden, then broken down for distribution to various destinations. Big Boys could handle the Sherman Hill segment brilliantly, but they couldn't efficiently handle the distribution runs. They were too powerful, too heavy, too specialized. Diesels could handle both the heavy mainline work and the lighter distribution work. One fleet instead of two. Lower total capital investment. Better asset utilization. Union Pacific's last Big Boy revenue run was in 1959, 18 years after the first unit entered service. The final runs weren't ceremonial. They were simply the last assignments before the locomotives were taken out of service and stored pending disposition. Some were scrapped immediately. Others sat in storage for years before being cut up. 8 were eventually preserved in museums, testimony to their engineering significance and cultural impact. But preservation didn't change the economic reality. The Big Boy had lost, not because it was poorly designed, not because it failed to perform, but because performance alone doesn't determine survival. Cost matters, flexibility matters, maintainability matters, infrastructure independence matters, and on every one of those measures, the diesel was superior. Not slightly better. Dramatically, decisively, overwhelmingly better. The small diesel that killed Big Boy didn't do it with power, it did it with economics, with operational flexibility, with reliability, with the ability to operate anywhere, anytime, without requiring millions in infrastructure investment or armies of specialized maintenance workers. 4,000 horsepower beat 6,000 horsepower because the contest was never about horsepower. It was about cost per ton mile, availability rate, infrastructure independence, and operational flexibility. And on those measures, the ones that actually mattered to railroad profitability, the diesel won before the race even started. The Big Boy sits in museums now. Impressive, powerful. A monument to an era when bigger seemed better and raw power seemed like the answer. But the diesel that replaced it, smaller, simpler, less dramatic, is still running freight across America today. Different models, updated technology, but the same basic principle. Electric motors driven by diesel generators, operating in multiple unit consists, requiring minimal infrastructure, delivering reliable service at sustainable cost. That's the lesson. Power isn't enough. That being the biggest doesn't guarantee survival. And sometimes the machine that wins is the one that just works, day after day, mile after mile, without drama, without requiring the world to be rebuilt to accommodate it. The small diesel killed Big Boy by being better at everything that mattered. And what mattered wasn't horsepower. It was economics.